alumna of Bowling Green State University and a secular activist. She is passionate about the intersection of religion and politics, namely the phenomena of Christian nationalism and American religious extremism in public policy. Beginning her academic career in philosophy and neuroscience, Charis transitioned to public administration to get more involved in public policy process to combat Christian nationalism. Let's give an absolutely wonderful welcome to Charis Hoard.
Today I'll be talking with you all about Christian nationalism and its impact on women of color. I will first start off, since I'm not physically in the room, just with who I am. Hi, I'm Charis. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. I currently live in Toledo, Ohio. I am a two-time Bowling Green State University alumna. I have a bachelor's in psychology, a master in public administration. Kind of some of the previous roles that I've held professionally. Back in 2020 for the presidential election, I worked as a work elections fellow with the Fair Election Center to help recruit and enroll poll workers in Wood County in Ohio to make sure that we had enough polling spaces open to keep Wood County safe while they're voting during the pandemic. Most of you may know me as a governmental affairs intern at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I was there for about a year, and now currently I am a researcher at Media Matters for America. So what we'll be going over today is segmented into 4 parts. We'll be starting off with what Christian nationalism is and kind of how I operationalize it, just to make sure we're all on the same page. We'll be talking about pure white womanhood, which is kind of the intersections of gender and race within evangelical spaces, as well as Christian nationalism, how this intersection impacts women of color, and then what can we do? What can we do to combat against this, but also what can we do to keep ourselves safe and to keep our communities safe? So first, we could start with what is Christian nationalism? Christian nationalism is the belief that America is a Christian nation founded on Christian beliefs, and with that, some also believe that America's founders are also Christians, and that America needs to return to its traditional Christian values, which we'll talk about a little bit later, in both government and society. The way that I operationalize it is through this Christian nationalism scale, which was created by Dr. Samuel Perry and Dr. Andrew Whitehead. They are both sociologists who study Christian nationalism, and this scale was created for their book, Taking Back America for God, which, if you have not read that book, it's life-changing, it's amazing, I highly recommend it. So they have a 6-question survey that they give to participants when they want to gauge kind of their belief in Christian nationalism. You can answer from each statement from 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree, 5 being highly agree. The statements are very straightforward. Like, one of them is very basically, I believe that America is a Christian nation. And you just kind of score whether or not, how closely you agree or disagree on that. And depending on your score, you fall into one of these 4 categories, and I'll just go through them very quickly. So rejectors usually score between a 0 and a 5 on their scale. Rejectors strongly disagree that America is a Christian nation, and they strongly believe in a separation of church and state. Rejectors are also the most likely to be activists and fight against Christian nationalism. So I kind of assume a lot of us here are rejectors in some fashion. Resistors are kind of the step above rejectors. They score between a 6 and 11 on their scale. They disagree that America is a Christian nation and believe in a separation of church and state, but they're a little less likely to be more active in their disagreement with Christian nationalism. If you ask them, they'll tell you their thoughts, but they usually won't be the ones kind of on the front lines fighting against. The next step is accommodators, who score between a 12 and an 18 on the scale. They may consider themselves to be a Christian and they believe in promoting Christian values, but they may not consider America to be a Christian nation and they may not want to see it be declared as such officially. And then we get to ambassadors, which is kind of what we usually think of when we think about Christian nationalists. We usually kind of mean ambassadors who score between an 18 and a 24 on the scale. They are 100% bona fide Christian nationalists. They believe America is a Christian nation, and they want to institutionalize Christianity in government and society. So basically, theocratize America. And while I let you digest this, I am going to attempt to quickly summarize about 60 or so years of the religious right and how we kind of got to the Christian nationalism that we see today. So the roots of Christian nationalism that we see today can be traced back to the religious right and moral majority of the 60s, spearheaded by figures such as Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell Sr. You may know his son, Falwell Jr. from Liberty University. Kind of the prevailing myth during the moral majority is that they initially mobilized around the ruling of Roe v. Wade and more anti-abortion, pro-life rhetoric. But in actuality, they mobilized around a Supreme Court case called Green v. Connolly, which was decided in 1971, where the Supreme Court decided that any institution that is either segregated or racially discriminatory cannot be considered as a charitable organization and therefore cannot have tax-exempt status under the IRS, which was an issue for the moral majority because that was basically all of their churches, all of their schools, all of their charities even. So you see a lot of evangelical figureheads that we sometimes hear about even today, such as Bob Jones Jr., who was the founder of Bob Jones University, actively fighting against the Supreme Court case because they believed that racial discrimination and segregation were mandated by the Bible and that it was their biblical duty to fight against the Supreme Court on this case. Clearly, they did not win, and a lot of those organizations, especially Bob Jones University, lost their tax-exempt status through the IRS. And now we move to the idea of pure white womanhood, especially the lost cause doctrine and lost cause rhetoric. So it was adopted by Southern white Christians post-Civil War, and it revisions the Confederates' loss as a crucifixion and believes that there will be a bright future for white supremacy after this period of suffering. So it's essentially mirroring the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This promotion and circulation of the lost cause doctrine helped to solidify white Southern women at the time as the guardians and the symbols of Southern culture, which also meant solidifying them as symbols of white culture and white supremacist culture. You don't really hear a lot about this doctrine today, but you will hear some remnants of it if you ever hear kind of the rhetoric in modern Christian spaces that Christians are the societal underdogs, that they're embattled and beaten down by the worldly secular society, or that they're the persecuted minorities, and that they need to fight back against that to rise again. it's basically remnants of this lost cause doctrine. Next, we're going to talk about complementarianism, which is a belief that men and women have different but complementary roles and responsibilities in marriage, family life, religious leadership, and society. Sometimes it's referred to as being ontologically equal but functionally different. Within complementarianism, the belief for men is to be the leaders, the providers, and the godheads of the family unit. So they will be the ones who are the breadwinners. They are the ones directing the family. They are the ones who are the pastors, the preachers, the leaders in church and within society. And then women, by contrast, are the, for lack of better words, the lesser so, the submissive to the dominant role. Women are expected to be the managers of the household and of the family, more namely the children. If women are leaders in any religious aspect, they are ministering to other women and only to other women. And kind of this view, we see a lot in what we think of as the nuclear family, which we know has very racially discriminatory roots. And both of these views together kind of conflate kind of white supremacist, racialized views with moral and religious beliefs. And this impacts women of color because I'll be speaking specifically about Blackness right now, just because I'm a Black woman. That's the context that I feel most comfortable speaking upon. But this is also generalizable to other women of color as a whole. This upholding of white women as the symbol of Southern culture, white culture, in kind of a demure aspect to be protected and preserved. Blackness and proximity to Blackness is the direct foil of that. Because Blackness is masculinized, so are Black women by default. The femininity that white women, and especially white Christian women, experience within the lost cause doctrine, complementarianism, kind of just Christian nationalism as a whole, is not afforded to women of color and Black women. Just as an example of how these views can become very dangerous, very violent, very fast, I'm going to be speaking very quickly about Dylan Roof, who was the shooter at Emmanuel AME Church back in 2015. I will not be showing any pictures of anything, but if this is too graphic for you, if it's too much for you, feel free to tune out, feel free to step away. No hard feelings at all. But within his manifesto, Roof talked about his views on Christianity and his views on specifically Jesus being white, and that Christianity is a warrior's religion. And when Roof was within the sanctuary of Emmanuel AME Church, and the parishioners were attempting to talk him out of what he was preparing to do, Roof exclaimed, "You are raping our women and taking over the country," meaning white women and taking over America, before he ended up killing 9 church members, attempting to start a race war. I'm very sorry, that's a very heavy statement, but it goes to show that kind of this conflating with racist views and moral views can take a very ugly turn very fast. If someone believes that an omnipotent, omnipresent, always correct being is dictating this like racial hierarchy in these racial views, as well as kind of this view that you have to fight for what you believe in, AKA lost cause doctrine, fighting against this woke culture, it's going to become very dangerous very fast for communities of color, especially for Black communities. And this leads us to what can we do? What can we do to fight back against this? And also what can we do to keep communities of color and ourselves safe while this rhetoric does not seem to be going anywhere anytime soon? So the first thing that we can do is to make sure that people who believe in these doctrines, people who are believers in Christian nationalism, no longer get to attain the levels of power that they seek to enact their viewpoints on the rest of our very secular society, to mobilize our communities and to vote for those who actively fight against these views, and to vote for those who are considerate and consider all religious viewpoints, or just in general, those who don't seek to kind of install a theocracy in America, for lack of better words. And what you can do to keep yourself safe is to learn more about this rhetoric, learn more about Christian nationalism. Knowing what you're facing, what you're fighting against is the greatest way to keep yourself safe. Knowing the enemy, for lack of better words, the enemy is a great way to be able to fight back against that, and also to hopefully see places in which this rhetoric can be poked at and hopefully dismantled. Thank you all for listening. This has been my first conference presentation, so thank you all for being patient with me and bearing with me. If you have any questions, you can ask them now. And if you'd like to see any of the resources or books that I used to make this presentation, or to learn more about Christian nationalism, feel free to email me and I will send you all of the resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, my question is, being that the United States seems to be becoming more secular, right? Do we think that Christian white nationalism is going to continue to grow? Is it going to shrink? In mental health, we talk about something called the extinction burst, where it's like a resurgence of whatever that thing is just before it dies out. So I'm wondering, do you think that that's what it is? Are we looking at this is going to keep getting worse? That sort of thing.
Thank you for that question. This is something that I think about a lot. We in a lot of aspects of our society where a kind of progressive action is met with an equal, harsher, more right-wing action, such as like the election of President Obama and that conservative backlash leading to the election of 45. Since like you said, our society is getting much more secular, I think secular voters are around a quarter of the electorate right now. We will definitely, in my view, continue to see a bigger pushback from Christian nationalism and Christian conservatives attempting to fight back against this more progressive, secular society that the rest of us want to see. That doesn't necessarily mean that Christian nationalism is growing in numbers, but it can mean growing in power and influence. But I definitely do believe that this is not necessarily a full death knell of Christianism, but I do believe that Christian nationalists know that their time is coming short. And that's why we're seeing such a huge pushback in public policy, in our judiciary, with the Supreme Court. They know that their time is coming to an end and they're trying to enact as much damage as possible before they're kicked.
My question is, I am a fan of actually having conversations with people. And I'm wondering, is there a way to approach possibly having conversations with people who are on the fringe so that they can possibly start influencing others who may be more so of the accommodators and the actual ambassadors of Christian nationalism to step away from that thought pattern?
This is an amazing question, because when we think about activism, I feel like a lot of us want to be the MLKs, the Malcolm X's, the notable figures on the front lines, but a lot of us really do underestimate how important and integral it is to have activism from person to person and just to talk to people and speak to people. There are absolutely ways to be able to speak to individuals and to kind of pull them away from that fringe. Personally, I have not, and I am not necessarily sure how. However, there are resources out there and there are organizations out there actually that work to help deprogram extremists and people who are seeking extremist groups and people who have been in extremist groups in the past. There are organizations out there who do have those resources. I just unfortunately do not. But if you do email me, I can help you find those for sure.
Any other questions? I have one quick question. So you said that you believe that Christian nationalism will die. Do you think that, I mean, I know at one time it may have been like part of the whole dog whistle kind of action. Do you think that before it actually dies, it's going to go back into some type of coded language before it fully dies out? And do you really think that it will fully die out? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. That is actually a big question to think about. I absolutely 4,000% agree that the dog whistles are already there, and they can freely communicate them in the open. However, if I can backtrack on my statement from earlier, I don't necessarily think Christian nationalism will die out and never come back, but it's probably going to go underground again. It's not going to be seen as popular in religious spaces anymore, and therefore go back underground and research as many other extremist groups have in the past. But I do believe that with the growing secular population in America, we do have an ability to possibly fight back against it for good. It's just a matter of how strong our mobilization can be, I believe. But I do believe that unfortunately they might resurge again someday. But I believe that we are kind of on the down curve right now. And Christian nationalists are realizing that and seeing that, trying to enact as much damage as they can before they go back underground, make a new strategy, and then come back in the future.
Hi, I didn't get the first part of your presentation, so if you've already addressed it, I apologize for asking again. We all know that hate is not something that you learn along the way if you don't learn that in your home. And we also know that education is the way to move forward out of things. Do you believe that there's a way that curriculum can make long-lasting change? I mean, we all know that, the kids learn about Martin Luther King and as my daughter said, Mom, isn't racism over? Because that's what Dr. Martin Luther King did, and it broke my heart. The innocence was there. So is there anything in particular that you think that curriculum can be done to address this long term? Thank you.
Absolutely. The greatest way to combat Christian nationalism from individual to individual is education. And that really needs to start in our churches. A lot of people encounter Christian nationalism for the first time, not from our very extreme conservative policymakers, but from their church and their pastors, who they've most likely grown up with and trusted. So they hear them say these more extreme views and them thinking, well, my pastor has never seen me wrong before. These are the words of God. Why would they intentionally tell us something false to hurt us? And that kind of leads a churchgoer, as well as the rest of the congregation in the church, further down this more extremist Christian nationalist pipeline. It really does need to start in the churches to combat Christian nationalism. How we do that necessarily, I am not entirely sure. It's kind of, I feel like it's going to be very different between denominations and especially between kind of the types of churches, whether they're kind of a more mega church and don't really have much person-to-person connection with each churchgoer versus a more intimately small church where the pastor and the congregation know each other more on a personal, friendly level. It kind of depends on like the level of trust and personable relationships that one can have within that church. But that education, that deprogramming can absolutely start in the church, and can greatly help limit how much of that seeps out from the church and into our children, for instance, into our policy and our policymakers, for one. But yes, education is very important to deprogram from this.
This is the last question.
Hi, Charis, it's Annie Murray, and I want to thank you so much for your fantastic work as our governmental affairs intern. We miss you, but we're so thrilled that you have the job of Media Matters. And I hate to ask, this is the last question, I didn't know it, because I have a kind of a negative question, but when I look at what happened after Reconstruction, when I look at history, things were going so well. Black men were being elected into state legislatures, even into Congress, and then we saw what happened. And it took a century to go back to get civil rights and all the terrible things that happened in between. What's to keep that from happening again now with abortion rights and all the LGBTQ and with the Christian nationalists setting themselves up as minority rule? Are we facing something like this again? Sorry, bad question, but I can't help worrying about it.
No, it's a very great question and also very necessary. No matter how negative it might seem, it's something that we do have to think about because it's a very real possibility. I think that as long as we have white supremacy, we will always kind of have Christian nationalism in some aspect, whether it's out and loud, or if it's more overt and underground. How we dismantle white supremacy and just kind of have a better world. I'm only 24. I don't know all of the answers yet. But it is definitely something to think about. When you think about a lot of these discriminatory views that fall under this white supremacist umbrella, such as like homophobia, transphobia, ableism, Christian nationalism being a part of that, they're all interconnected. And dismantling one can help aid in dismantling the others, but they're still there. It really just kind of requires all of us who want to see a better world for ourselves, for our children, our children's children, to continue to fight against this. Christian nationalism is very big and very powerful. White supremacy is very big and very powerful, but that doesn't mean that we can just accept that that's how things are, because things have never changed or gotten better in society because we just threw up our arms and we're like, well, that's just how it is, so we have to live with it. It requires all of us who care enough and are able to do so to fight back in any way that we can, whether it be individual to individual, speaking with those in your community or those in your family or your friends about their views on certain topics. And if they're a little more extreme or just inaccurate in general, to help them kind of step back from that fringe and realize what they're doing. Or if it involves lobbying, helping with political campaigns of candidates who also want to push back and fight against these discriminatory views and values. We all can do so much right where we are, and there's no better time to start than now, really.